Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the second session on day 2 of the Digital Transformation in Government Conference. The speaker today is Dr. Pallab Saha, and his title is going to be Digital Transformation in India. Pallab is the Open Group General Manager for the country of India, and he's responsible for its business operations and growth in India and the region. He's been featured in Forbes. He's a senior lead expert in enterprise architecture, and he's also a visiting professor of digital architecture at the Indian Institute of Management and Visakh. He's also a key contributing author of the India Enterprise Architecture Framework and the Digital Service Standard, and the co-author of the Agile IndEA Framework. He's been playing a critical role in India EA and the digital transformation in government there. He was formerly the chief architect to Andhra Pradesh State Enterprise Architecture, and it's been lifted to national prominence and international prominence as well. He was previously head of the Wipro's government and public sector architecture practice, and he was instrumental in creating a government-focused architecture domain. He has published 5 books on enterprise architecture. His PhDs in information systems from the Indian Institute of Science at Bangalore, and he received the Best Research Design and Best Thesis Awards for his doctorate. He's also an alumnus of the MIT Sloan's Executive Program and the Wipro Business Leaders Program. Without further ado, I turn it over to Pallab. Thank you very much for coming and presenting at this conference.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, good evening to all of you from wherever you're joining in today. And that was a very generous introduction by Bob, but I'd like to thank the organizer of this conference for giving me an opportunity to present the journey that we have taken in India with respect to the digital government transformation, which is, of course, very much aligned to the overall theme of this conference. This is the agenda. We don't have to go through this. I'll cover this in the slides. So before we get into the presentation per se, this is something that I'd like to put right in the beginning up front so that the context is set. The purpose of digital transformation, that the way we look at it in India, is to improve the quality of governance. Yes, there are certain aspects which drives governance, for instance, the development of digital infrastructure, the overall modernization of technology across the government, the general increase and rise in the consumption of digital services by the citizens and users, and availability of data integration. But something for us not to forget is that ultimately the whole idea and the primary purpose of doing digital transformation is to improve the quality of governance and not be a backdoor conduit to accumulate technology bloat. So this is something that I wanted to put upfront, because this was a very important philosophy, if you will, that we took in kind of charting the journey, charting the roadmap that I'm going to walk you through today in the next 40 to 45 minutes. So the whole idea is to make government and governance more efficient and effective, to make it more inclusive and participatory, and make it more transparent and accountable. So if you see the gist of this slide, yes, technology does play a very important role, but ultimately it is to improve the quality of governance. So with this, the agenda for our digital transformation was established. So what you see here is the overall agenda of what is called Digital India. And you see it spans all the way from infrastructure to improving the human capital, the capability, establishing the policy and legal regulatory frameworks, creating digital government platforms, its impact into the digital economy as a whole, covering for privacy, data privacy, security and integrity aspects, and ultimately also getting onto the smart city and smart villages, if you will. So this is basically the entire gist of Digital India, which is driving the digital transformation agenda in the country. But a very important element of this is right in the center of that circle that you see. All of this needs to be taking a whole of government approach. And what I'm going to walk you through is how we have achieved the whole of government approach in India, because it's significant, because India is a very large, diverse, with a humongously large population. So it's important for us to understand what whole of government actually means in the context of the scale that we are talking of in India. So this is something that would be a very interesting case study for any country, but the scale is very different. So something for you to keep in mind as you kind of take away the learning points from today's presentation. This is our view of how digital government or tech-enabled government has evolved. So what you can see here is we have moved from, so this is a journey of the last 35, 40 years. We have moved from analog government to e-government to digital government and some of the characteristics of digital government, right? Obviously, all of this will be covered in details in the subsequent slide, but what is more important is the arrow in the bottom, which says that the role of enterprise architecture, the role of digital architecture becomes more and more prominent, if you will, when as the impact of tech-enabled government improves and increases in the context of governance, so which is very important. And this leads us to the key elements of digital government that we believe are important. So as you can see here, it starts all the way from leadership and governance to improving public administration, reforms, change management, even addressing the cultural aspects of digitization, improving the technology infrastructure, modernizing the data infrastructure, coming up with common data standards, addressing cybersecurity, privacy, and resilience issues, supporting all of the changes that we are talking of within the digital ecosystem with legislation and regulations. Now, my intent is not to go into the details, but these are some of the critical success factors that we call the dimensions of digital government that we have identified in India. And I'm sure this kind of resonates with most countries because some of these are very fundamental requirements that are absolutely essential to make digital government successful, to kind of realize the values, to kind of realize the outcome of digital transformation. So as I said, architecture played a very important role, in fact, continues to play a very important role in India. So the foundation of the digital government, areas that I highlighted in the last two slides, it stands on the pillar of something what we call is the India Enterprise Architecture Framework. What you see here is the vision of the India Enterprise Architecture Framework. In short, it's called IndEA, right? So the vision of IndEA is to establish best-in-class architecture governance processes, practices with optimal utilization of ICT infrastructure. The whole idea is to provide the citizens a one government experience and to support some level of boundaryless information flow. Now, within the framework perspective, there are 4 parts. Now, my intent here is not to go into the details of the 4 parts, but just to give you a kind of a summary of this. So part 1 is a collection of the reference models, which is based on TOGAF and other standards of the open group. Part 2 is the IndEA adoption guide. This is basically a step-by-step approach of how the government agencies and departments must be building their enterprise architecture for digital services. Part 3 is the digital service standard itself. As you know, this is a standard, so therefore there is a compliance element to this. And part 4 is the Agile IndEA Framework, which was an outcome of the request that we received from the departments and agencies saying that yes, we understand the value of architecture in the context of digital transformation, in the context of digital government, but we need to take an agile approach because that's how the citizens are going to be getting their services as quickly as possible. Now, on the right of the slide, you see the 8 dimensions of the IndEA. So this is the usual expansion of the BDAT, as we are all aware in the context of architecture. So it starts all the way from performance, goes to business, covers application, technology, infrastructure, security, integration, governance, and management. And as I have already mentioned, this is based on TOGAF. So therefore, that provides us an element of assurance that we are linking it to a globally default enterprise architecture standard that we are all aware of. Now, within the methodology, as I said, this is the high-level view of what we call our digital government architecture process. I'm not going to go into the details, but I think all of you being architects would understand the general gist of what we are trying to achieve here. So we take it as a 4-step process, understanding the current context, doing a situation analysis, following up with the definition of the vision of the future, which is step number 2, then following with the step number 3, which is coming up with a strategy and a roadmap, and there are some sub-steps within that, and finally within an implementation. So the important point here is that number 1 is it takes a whole of government approach, which I'm going to elaborate in a bit. And second is the architecture itself, the approach of the architecture is aligned towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals as defined by the United Nations. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples a few slides later. But the whole idea here is that we do have a methodology, a detailed methodology behind this, defining each of the steps. There are standards, there are guides, there are best practices provided for the value of the government ministries and departments to ensure that every state, every department, every ministry has a simple set of guidance for it to be achieving its architecture specification and eventually contributing to the national UN sustainable goals, sustainable development goals. Now, at the end of the journey, what we're trying to achieve here is this. So this is based on certain aspects that we think are important from a whole of government perspective. That's why I said we have taken a whole of government perspective. So the number one aspect of the whole of government perspective is, creating core government systems, which could be, for instance, setting up a government cloud for the whole country, interoperability standards, creating a service bus, an API, even an API bridge, so to speak. There are cybersecurity standards which take a whole of government perspective. There are certain core systems which focus on, let's say, human resource management, payroll, e-procurement, project management, tax, customs, so on and so forth. There are certain sectoral systems which focus on priority sectors like health, like education, like finance, like social protection, like justice, like transportation, those are the sectoral information systems. The second part of the core government systems is how do we bring in disruptive technologies to enable some of those changes. Disruptive technology here could mean big data, blockchain, AI, machine learning, IoT, remote process automation, smart applications, so on and so forth. So that you see in the center. All of this with the intent of improving public service delivery and citizen engagement with all of the online services, the digital, which is where the digital service standard comes in. Even digital ID, for instance, is a very important reusable capability that we have, functional registries. I'll show you some of the registries later on. And how do we use the open data that the government has already published in our portal, right? And all of this is provided with enabling capabilities, which are the more softer skill, if you will, like the leadership, digital skills. You have the strategies, you have the regulations, the legal aspects, the institutions, including training for civil service officers and any level of innovation that is required. So this in a nutshell provides what we are trying to achieve in a whole of government perspective, which is driven by the architecture, which I just presented a couple of slides back. Now, as I said, we have identified certain core building blocks. So this slide and the next slide identified 25 reusable building blocks that we use across our platforms and systems. This should also be interesting to you because a couple of hours later, you're going to hear Yolanda from ITU, who's also going to talk about an initiative called GovStack, which actually has borrowed the idea of using core building blocks or reusable building blocks from this kind of approach. So you're going to see a similar approach that GovStack, she's going to talk about GovStack. So what you see here are the core aspects, core capabilities that are required across systems, and that gives us an element of economies of scale, if you will. So for instance, if we have digital identity, we have a digital identity for the entire country for a population of 1.4 billion. You have digital registries pertaining to certain verticals. I'll show you some examples of digital registry. It could be messaging, it could be cloud, as I said, government cloud. Security, there are security rules. In fact, there are certain areas where we are moving into public digital platforms where our security direction is moving to a zero trust, so to speak. So I don't intend to go into the details of this, but I'm sure you get the point that these 24 building blocks are like the fundamental reusable capabilities that provide us certain aspects which are required irrespective of the ministry or the department or the province or the state you come from, because these are fundamental capabilities that are required. How does this work? That's why I said this is an example. So typically what we do is we use the sustainable development goals to identify the priorities. As you see here, the top layer speaks about SDG, which could be priorities pertaining to agriculture, pertaining to health, pertaining to education, pertaining to social services, pertaining to rural development. Based on that, there are certain use cases that are identified. Those use cases are then expanded as workflows. So the business process workflows are defined based on those use cases. The workflow is elaborated, and as the workflow is elaborated, we are able to therefore identify the reusable capabilities that are required to digitize those workflows. I'm going to show you an example with the health ecosystem, but this is the overall approach that we take to identify and use those 24 reusable building blocks to provide us a whole of government capability. Having said that, imagine, we are in a situation where we are trying to have in the ministries and the departments to identify and use those reusable capabilities. However, being a large, diverse country with multiple states, multiple subnational governments, so we have 4 levels of government. What is important for us constitutionally is to respect the autonomy that the subnational entities have within the Constitution of India, which means that even though we have a federal government, the states and the provinces and the districts do have a significant amount of autonomy. So what we have done here is that we have created a concentric view of the capabilities. So there are certain capabilities which are required for the entire country, for instance, like a digital ID, right? Everybody is citizen of India, therefore you need to have a digital ID. And there are certain capabilities which are best kept at the local level. So for instance, if it's a patient information, the patient is coming from the rural area, a farmer coming into the rural patient public health service. So the patient information resides within the public health center itself. It is not actually sent up to the Ministry of Health at the central level, because it's only the link that is sent. It's not the actual data that is transmitted, because this is how the autonomy and the ability to control your own data comes in. And that's very important from our perspective, because this is how we achieve federation within architecture. Now, as I said, this is how we have adopted the TOGAF partitioning structure. So what you see on the left are the reference architectures right on top, which I was mentioning earlier, and the digital service standards. Now they are now partitioned into sector-specific architecture, which some of you may call it segment architecture. We do take a sectoral view of the architecture. So we have the digital health architecture, the digital education architecture, digital agriculture architecture, so on and so forth. So that represents the priority sectors. Remember, all of this link up and roll up to the sustainable development goals. Those sectoral architectures are then realized using reusable building blocks, which I showed you earlier. So you can see some of the reusable building blocks or core government systems, as I showed you in one of my previous slides, to enable those sectoral architectures. And these sectoral architectures then come together to enable the national, so to speak, the national enterprise architecture in our view. So this is how we have partitioned, keeping in view the constitution of the country, respecting the federalism that we have in India, and yet ensuring that the common architecture is still in place, and some of the requirements, specifications, and other nuances, so to speak, are respected across the country, as the way architecture gets implemented. Right. So what we do here is I'm giving you a couple of examples now in terms of how we have achieved the sectoral view, and we call this concept a public digital platform. So what we are doing now is, even as we speak, India is rolling out public digital platforms in different areas. And there are very important reasons why we are moving into this, because we believe that the future is open ecosystems supported by open technology standards. Therefore, it is important that, and government has realized this, that the government does not have to be the core and sole provider of a digital service. It has to be providing or playing the role of an enabler, and also encouraging other innovations, other organizations, be it in the public and private sector, to participate in these platforms in a collaborative manner so that better services can be provided. Now, this is easier said than done, because there are a lot of governance issues that comes into play, and I'm going to walk you through in a bit about that. So in terms of the public digital platforms, there are multiple that we can talk of, but I'm just listing out a few here. So we have the first one, which is the digital health platform. Then we have the platform for, as you can see, the urban innovation stack. That's the platform for our smart cities. Then we have a platform for education. We have a platform for a state finance solution. We also have a platform for digital commerce. Now, obviously, we do not have time to cover all of this. I'm going to briefly elaborate on the health and the digital commerce platform. In addition to these, there are efforts underway which look at creating the public digital platforms in other sectors like power and energy, women and child, skills and employment, logistics, transportation, industry consortium, criminal justice system, tourism, so on and so forth. All of this take a sectoral approach, it takes a whole of government approach, it follows the IndEA, but it also contributes and rolls up to the sustainable development goals. So let me quickly walk you through the health and the digital commerce platform. So this is called the National Digital Health Mission. And fundamentally, what we are trying to achieve through our digital health platform is these questions. So for instance, and these are very fundamental questions, and I'm sure it would be relevant to any country in the world, right? It's not specific to India, but that's how it is, right? The business questions are more important. How do we improve patient experience, safety, quality of care? How do we improve or integrate cross care and care across settings? How do we do more with less money? How do we create more value for patients? How do we ensure that the quality of health service is important? That is fundamentally what we are trying to achieve through the digital health, right? And the vision of the national digital health architecture is presented on this slide. Now, what you see on top is the actual achievement of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal number 3, which focuses on health. But the important point here is the other targets, the other SDG targets, what you see here, relevant SDG targets, are also equally important, because this is how the sustainable development goals are designed. Even though you might think that this is a health or digital health platform, why are we talking of other targets, other goals, which are not technically not related to health, but actually there is a relationship between the goals and targets, SDG goals and targets, because the way they are designed, it is not ministry or department specific. It's ultimately you want to improve the health of lives and well-being, and therefore for that, in addition to health, you have to take care of many things. So in a nutshell, it actually shows you the linkages between the sustainable development goals, taking an integrated holistic approach. The key capabilities of the digital health mission is obviously coming up with a personalized health ID, having a federated health record, which I'm going to talk about, enabling open telemedicine, e-pharmacy, having standardized health registry, providing universal health coverage, and providing the data for analytics, which is very important, because this is how we improve our decision-making capabilities within the context of digital health. Now, this is the architecture. As you see here, there are user applications which are specific across and which are common across the entire health sector. Keep in mind, we are taking a whole of government approach. So we have user solutions, apps, which may or may not be government apps. It could also be developed by a startup, for instance, who want to be part of the digital health platform. Then this is supported in the second layer by a unified health interface. This is almost like a service bus where all the applications talk, and through API, bus, all of the applications can exchange information. The data exchange is important. I did mention health registries, the registries, right? So the registries that we have created in the digital health architecture pertain to health ID, health professionals, health facilities, drugs and medications, pharmacies. So these are all the kinds of registries that are important. And all of this operate on top of the reusable building blocks, which I showed you earlier. Now, please note, this is the bottom layer. Please note, these are the brand names or the product names, solution names. What I've shown you earlier are the generic names, but these are the same exact reusable building blocks. And why are these important? Because the lower level, the lowest level that you see here, the lowest layer, the reusable building blocks remains common across all platforms. They are, I would say, they are domain agnostic, which means that you will see the same building blocks being reused across health, across transportation, across education, so on and so forth. So that is the overall logical architecture of the digital health that is currently in practice already in India. This shows you the, I would say, the interaction view. Again, as you can see right in the center, there is an API gateway, which is supported by the different registries, and how the different, I would say, stakeholders, so to speak, are actually interacting with one another, which consists of information providers, hospitals, labs, clinics. It could be, it could be even polyclinics providing data, because we are talking of for instance, a primary health center in a very remote area of the country, and they are also part of the overall health ecosystem or health platform that we are talking of. Now, very important aspect of health is, as we understand, health is a very sensitive area. So anything to do with health data is supported by expressed consent by the people. So if I have my health record and that needs to be shared because I'm being referred from a primary center to a tertiary or a specialized center, that health data can be transmitted only after I give consent to the system saying that, yes, I'm okay for the primary health center A to be sending my, for instance, MRI scans to a specialized center. This is, so the consent aspect is a very important element of data security and data privacy, which is one of the common threads that you will see across all the public digital platforms that we have developed. You're right. As you see here, these are the different actors in the health ecosystem, ranging all the way from information provider to the consent manager, to the client, to a central registry, as I said, the digital registry, information records, the citizen, the health locker, where you can actually archive all your medical records, so on and so forth. So keep in view that all of these elements, all of these actors need not belong to the government, because we are building a sectoral ecosystem. They can be coming from the private sectors, and they do, some of them are actually using the open data that the government has provided to create services and participating in the healthcare ecosystem that we are talking of here. As I said, I will show you the link all the way from the SDG goal to the use cases. So this is an example which shows you right at the top, we have the sector health, we have the SDG 3, good health and well-being, that is then expanded into the targets. So these are provided by the United Nations. You can see the 2 targets there. From the targets, we identify the use case that is required. Then we expand the use cases into its 7 steps. You can see the 7 steps there. And we then elaborate the business workflow. As the business workflow is highlighted and elaborated, you can see the reusable building blocks, which is the lowest layer. And those reusable building blocks which could remain common across sectors. This is not specific to health. I could have a similar use case in the education sector using the same reusable building blocks. So that gives us the whole of government perspective, because this is the economies of scale that comes in. So this is what I was saying as to how we link it all the way up to the sustainable development goals. Right, so this is the remote consultation process. This is a typical use case diagram. As you can see here, there are the reusable building blocks in blue, and then some of the provider apps are provided in green there. So you can see, this, as if you understand what a use case is, this is exactly what a use case is, with all the steps across the different participants, if you will, of the ecosystem, and how they collaborate amongst one another. The second one, so that's the health one briefly. The second one that is currently being rolled out is the open network for digital commerce. Now, today, I'm sure all of you are, especially with the 2.5 years of pandemic, all of you have used an Amazon service to order something, right? And I'm sure, or any other e-commerce provider that may be popular in your country or in your geography. But we all understand that these services are very platform centric, which means if I order an item on Amazon, it's Amazon which is who's going to deliver it. Now, if you really, so that's a very closed platform, right? Now, India is actually getting to a point where we are trying to move to an open network centric platform, where it doesn't matter who you order your product with, and it doesn't matter who fulfills the product, because as long as it's an open network, that's how it should be, right? So for instance, an example of open network is I could send, I could send a letter from India to Canada. It is India Post that is taking the letter, and the delivery in Canada is happening by the Canadian Post, right? So because there is an inter-services agreement between the different postal departments. Now, that does not exist in the e-commerce sector. It is very platform specific. You have to become platform, and therefore there are ramifications. The buyers therefore have to be part of the platform and multiple platforms. Similarly, the sellers also have to be part of the multiple platform. Now, that is not a very efficient approach. So what India will do is, now we are using open protocols. As you can see the picture here, it shows you that your buyers and sellers only use open protocols, and as long as your product is delivered, it doesn't matter who is fulfilling. So that is exactly what we're trying to achieve through the open network for digital commerce. And all of this is based on open protocols and open APIs that you see here on the slide, right? So this is the kind of components that are currently being built, right? You can see here different types. The biggest advantage of this is it becomes platform agnostic. It becomes lot more scalable, because as a buyer, I just register once on the digital commerce network, and then I get a plethora of service providers who can give me the products, and I don't have to. So there are no multi-homing costs, right? So that's one of the biggest problems with the current way digital commerce works, because it's very platform centric. As I said, these are the impacts and implications, right? It creates disintermediation. We move from proprietary platform-centric approach to an open platform agnostic approach. It rationalizes because merchants wanting to sell their products will now only have to register once, right? Similarly, it demonopolizes. It does not create a monopoly that we currently see in the digital commerce market. It creates an element of standardization because we are based on open technology standards. It amplifies the benefits both for the entire country. Of course, this is what digital economy is all about, right? This is what we're trying to achieve. All of this, of course, brings in agile regulation, and obviously there's some element of digital sovereignty and innovation that comes in as this platform is being rolled out even as we speak. All right, so I'll not go into the benefits of it. I think you understand in a nutshell what we're trying to achieve with the ONDC, which is Open Network for Digital Commerce. Right. Now, these are the two examples that we speak of. As I said, we will talk about this, and we just spoke about health. We spoke about digital commerce. There are, of course, a lot more examples, but given the time I have, this is what I wanted to highlight. Now, all of this is supported by good public digital infrastructure. So these are some of the characteristics, if you will, some of the attributes that we look for when we design and roll out public digital infrastructure. Obviously, the attributes come from the supply side and the demand side. The most important aspects are highlighted in dotted lines there: data protection, consumer protection. It should be available, it should be easily usable, for instance, right? And it should really have an outcome and an impact at the social level. So therefore, that's, I said, right, the fundamental reason why we are doing digital transformation with enterprise architecture is to improve the quality of governance. That's fundamental, because this is not a way to bring in new technology. Technology will enable, we all understand that, but it's to improve the quality of governance. All right, so what do we do when we come up with a requirement of a public digital platform? So I've given you two examples, instances of how we have come up with the public digital platform. So typically when we establish the need for a digital platform, what we do first is create a digital platform canvas. So this is a variation of the business model canvas that all of us are aware of. I'm sure anybody who's studied any level of business analysis is aware of the BMC, the business model canvas. So this is a variation of the business model canvas specifically applied to platforms and ecosystems. So as you can see here, it's structured very similarly, but the questions are specific to what you would need to address a platform specific requirement based on what is the kind of sector we are trying to achieve through this platform. So this is then supported by certain guiding questions. So for instance, questions with respect to what is the mission of the platform, how do different stakeholders get access to the platform, what are the participation aspects, what is the governance and conduct, and how the platform data is shared across participants in the ecosystem. So these are some of the guiding questions that we use when we fill up the digital platform canvas, which I showed you in my previous slide. This is then supported by a common platform reference architecture. So this is the generic architecture that goes behind all of the platforms that I spoke about. I've presented two to you as an example, the digital health one and the digital commerce one. But this is the generic reference architecture, and this comes from, and this is derived from, the India Enterprise Architecture Framework that I showed you earlier. So this is how we achieve the whole of government architecture. You can see the different layers all the way from users to access channels to business capabilities of a platform, data capabilities, application infrastructure, integration, and governance. So these are the things that we keep in mind when we start designing a platform. So first we do the platform canvas, then we have the guiding questions, and then we have the platform reference architecture. We also know how a platform works. So we have taken a systemic view of how public digital platform work. This is a simplified view of the digital health platform that I just showed you, right? So we know what are the things are important so that we are able to intervene at the right level. So those of you who are familiar with systems thinking will know that there are certain interventions that you can make into a system diagram to actually make it more amenable and make it more, I would say potentially successful. And that's what we use this kind of approach to understand the dynamics of how a PDP works, a public digital platform works. Right. These are some of the core platform principles in 3 different buckets. One is the governance aspect, second is the technology aspect, and the third is the process aspect. So you can see the governance aspect is very important because, as I said, a platform is an open platform. Therefore, it includes both government and private sector, even startups and entrepreneurs who can use open government data to provide services and participate in the platform. So this is actually how the digital economy gets realized as we are speaking. So platforms are a way to realizing the digital economy that we speak of. I'll not go into the details. I think some of you do understand the other technology and the process principles, but I think this is how it creates a sustainable economic model, all the way supporting the sustainable development goals. Right. Now, you might always ask that how come we have so many different platforms and how do we ensure that we have some level of governance across the platform? This is what we call as the cross-platform governance. So there are different individuals and communities who are getting the services. So that's your top level. They are being supported by digital services that we speak of. And for each of the areas like mobility, healthcare, finance, digital commerce, public services, energy, transportation, education, we have public digital platforms. As I said, these are sector-based collaboration pages. They are very sectoral specific. However, all of this is supported by cross-cutting applications and reusable building blocks, which I mentioned earlier. So those are the 24 building blocks which I showed you earlier. They are not platform specific, they are platform agnostic, but it provides us a way to create the base which is connected across for the whole of government. So this is how we bring in agile governance, which is cross-platform, to ensure that the architecture remains consistent, the architecture is complied with, and we achieve the digital services which are consistent across different platforms. Right, as I mentioned you previously, right, this is an example of how different goals of the sustainable development goals are actually linked to one another. Here you can see this is an example, right? If you're familiar with the SDGs, it consists of 17 goals, 169 targets, and 241 indicators. And you can see here goal number 7, which is access to electricity, is actually linked to goal number 3, which is life expectancy, through a series of connections. So this is how the SDGs are, and they are deliberately like this. So for any country to achieve all of those 17 goals, it is important that the country takes a whole of government approach, which means that the different entities of the government, departments, ministries, and the subnational governments therefore collaborate. Otherwise, it would be almost impossible to achieve the 17 goals in the SDG. So I just wanted to highlight that it forces us to, SDG actually forces us to think systemically, think holistically, and come up with integrated solutions. Now, what we are also trying to achieve at this point is, I think the rest of the slide is fairly straightforward. What we're trying to achieve is link architecture to the budget cycle. So we are using the SDGs and targets to create budget planning. We are using the use cases and services, which I showed you and as an example, to prepare the budget. We are using the workflows for allocation of the budget, and we are using the building blocks, for budget control. This is very important because otherwise architecture, as you know, would be seen as a technical initiative, and it has got no implication to the overall financial performance of the entity or of the organization. So one of the things we want to achieve, and this is work in progress, is to link architecture all the way, so link development all the way to value, to adoption, to budget, which is very important because this is why the decision makers, the senior bureaucrats actually take interest in the architecture and what it can do for the overall purpose of the ministry or the department they are heading. Okay, I'll not go into the details. There are different funding and financing options that we use. It could be grant-based aid, it could be taxes, it could be government borrowing, private sector capital, income streams, and cost savings. Why are these important? Because these are open digital platforms, which means that, as I said, government may or may not be funding some of these things, or even if it is funding, it could be funding partially, which means that there are other ways to look for financing options that we look for within the public digital platforms. So we have done a comparison of the different financing options, and we choose whatever is relevant within the specific context. Now, having said all of this, it is important for one question for us as architects is for us to understand that we have to keep the architecture framework itself pertinent, relevant, right? So this picture shows you how we keep the architecture framework, which I talked about in the beginning, relevant and updated. So as you see, the IndEA Enterprise Architecture Framework sets the reference models. These reference models create or guide the creation of segment or sectoral architecture, which I walked you through, which are called the public digital platform. As the digital platform specifications are defined, they help building the solution architectures, which are then implemented through multiple projects. Now, the important point is at the time of solution architecting and the implementation, these building blocks that I showed you earlier are being used. Now, the question that should come in your mind is, how do we know that the 24 building blocks are it? Can't we have a 25th and a 26th? Absolutely. We can have a 25th and a 26th building block, because those kind of requirements will come as the implementation gets along. Because if a state government or a ministry or a department is implementing, because they are closer to the ground, so to speak, they would easily identify saying that, hey, out of these 24, there's one thing which we feel is missing. Can that be taken into the next version of the building blocks? Absolutely. So that contributes to the augmentation of the architecture and the assets repository. Basically, that's the building block. So over time, we believe that we will have more building blocks, because these requirements come from on-ground experiences that the different ministries and the states and the departments are actually playing out even as the architecture and the solutions are getting implemented. So this is what we call as a framework for pertinence, to keep the architecture relevant and updated over time. All right, one thing that we have realized is that all of the technology, all of the frameworks, all of the best practices are good. However, we also need tech-savvy civil servants to ensure that the digital technologies are used. So that's important. So what we have done is I'm showing you a framework that we are currently rolling out, which includes educating the civil servants, creating a faculty development ecosystem, evaluating them, giving them a chance to try out through labs, through innovation labs, right, and sandboxes, and then implementing those projects and learning from those projects and completing the feedback loop, so to speak. So this is a closed loop structure that we are trying to address, create a cadre of tech-savvy civil service officers so that they become better. I would say they are more open to adopting digital technologies to improve the governance, because at the end of the day, that's what matters to them. It's not the technology that matters. It is, how's it going to improve my governance across departments, across ministries? Right, I think this is almost the last slide. Benefits of digital transformation in government. So this is a summary. It gives us universal access, inclusiveness, and responsiveness. For benefits, it creates a culture of data-driven decisions. As you know, data is a very important element of our architecture, right? It improves coordination and linkages between schemes and programs across the SDG. It reduces gaps and duplications in the service delivery chain. It gives us the ability to identify new services. In fact, many of the services have been discovered as a result of the analysis that I just walked you through. Generally, it does encourage innovation across the ecosystem. So this is the way that the digital economy is getting realized through digital platforms in the different sectors that we spoke about. All right, I think, yes, how is India faring in the BCG Digital Service User Satisfaction Survey 2020? We are ranked within the top 3 globally. So you can see the details there. I'm not going to talk about the details there. Similarly, with the World Bank GovTech Maturity Index, we are again within the top quadrant, the group A, so to speak, which are termed as GovTech leaders, right? And recently, one of our projects got the best award from the UN. So this is the Meghalaya Enterprise Architecture. Meghalaya is one of the states in India. So the state enterprise architecture got one of the UN, not one of them. In fact, this is the best project in the UN, which was just given on 31st May. So it is as fresh as it can get, right? Just barely 2 weeks back. So this is how India is doing in terms of the achievement of the digital service, both from a user satisfaction perspective and from a GovTech maturity perspective. So with that, I think that is my last slide. Yes, thank you very much. And Bob, back to you.
Thank you very much, Pallab. That was a wonderful presentation. Very intense, very much approved. To be quite honest with you, there was one major question that was basically put in by the and has several votes. What's the level of acceptance by the business of the structured planning using architecture? Is it overwhelming to business folks?
Good question. Now, one of the things that we have done is that whenever we come up with a sectoral architecture, so as I've told you, at the national level, we have defined the reference models, we have defined the standards, everything has been done, right? When we roll it down to the sectors, we make sure that the sector and the relevant ministry, the business, owns that platform. Otherwise, it does not go ahead. It is not something that is undertaken by the Ministry of Electronics or Ministry of Information Technology, as we would call it. They would only enable it. But so, for instance, when you're talking of the health domain, right, the health architecture, digital health, it is completely owned by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So those are the business owners. Same thing with education. So we have ensured, and that's a precondition before any platform is taken for development and rollout. If there is no business ownership, we do not take it forward. So that's another way of putting at it. In terms of acceptance, having seen the success of health, education, transportation, the other ministries are also lining up saying that, hey, I think we can benefit from this, and therefore let's take this forward.
Okay, well, thank you. No, that's really important. The next question we have, the content of the India ecosystem or framework is extremely rich in information and relationships. How do you manage the relationship diagram and content? Do you use a specific tool or or methodology to maintain the accuracy of the content?
Yes, so there is a methodology. We have not used the tool yet, but there is a plan to use a tool later on. But we do have a methodology, and there is an advisory team that meets in regular intervals. Roughly, it's once a quarter, and see if there are any changes that are required. Now, the changes can be coming from any of the stakeholders who are part of the ecosystem, including where it is being implemented. So that's very important. It could come from the advisory board. It could come from some of the startups who are part of the ecosystem. It could even come from the implementing ministry. So absolutely, but we do ensure that this is updated and this is kept relevant to the specific the task in hand.
All right. Did that answer your question, Bruno? If you have anything else, just type it into the questions. Okay, I've got some other questions then. There was a slide on things that did not work well. Could you speak to some of those from a lessons learned perspective?
Oh yeah, I mean, let me just see, I'll go back. So these are some of the impediments, right, that we face, which are common across. So the first one, which I did not highlight, but I think maybe that's, answering the question. So number one is, the way the bureaucracy is designed, it is based on industrial engineering, industrial era, which is 17th, 18th century. So therefore that change is definitely required. Now in the government, the vertical hierarchical structure is still the fundamental organization form. So they do feel a little insecure when you suddenly start talking of digital platforms, which require different ministries to share data, to collaborate. In many cases, the legislations, the mandates, the government orders, the regulations, they actually, including the budgeting process, they actually reinforce silo approaches, silo decision-making, and they are disconnected from the integrated approach that the architecture and the digital transformation is trying to bring. So these are some of the changes. Accountability, ambiguous. It's not easy to find somebody accountable for a specific system within the government, because of the ambiguity. And the bullet number 5 is absolutely, as I said, the way the budgeting is done, and that's why we are linking it to all the way from budget planning to budget control. The way budgeting is done, it actually inhibits sharing and collaboration. It negatively influences collaboration, right? Because everybody says, this is my budget, that's your budget, whose budget is it coming from? So it is designed to operate in silos. So these are some of the impediments we face. And I'm sure this is common across governments, across countries. So I thought I'll put it here so that, it kind of kind of creates some thinking in our minds as to how do we address these issues.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons we put capability-based planning and looked at capabilities in TOGAF, because, you know, basically get the budgeting, instead of having 6 projects delivering one capability, have one. Anyways, no, that's great. The next question we have, sorry, I'm just going to answer now. Can you elaborate on the consent mechanism regarding the impact it may have if citizens choose not to give consent to use their personal data? How do you deal with that situation?
So the impact in a citizen not giving the consent, is it? Is that the question?
The impact is, what do you do when people don't want to share their data? Their personal data.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't do anything. I mean, it obviously, the digital service does not get completed, so to speak, if the citizen does not give data or does not give consent for sharing of data across different entities. So that's how it is, right? It just stops there.
Okay. The next one is, sorry, oops, two-step planning. The next question will be, the architecture planning seems perfectly done, but what about the change management aspect? How do you achieve a successful transition from the traditional process to a new one? And how many of the platforms you presented are live now? Sorry, it's a three-barreled question.
Yeah, absolutely. The first one is the change management aspect. We see it is not so difficult to change at the lower levels in the government because they are more open to digital services. Sometimes I would say sometimes the pushback comes from the senior civil servants, and that's the reason I showed you the framework that we are currently rolling out to create tech-savvy civil servants, right? So that's one part of the change management. The second part of that is it's a continuous process. Not that we have answered all the questions. As you know, India, we are a large country, complex country, and there are pushbacks that we face, and therefore. And this is coming back to your third question, how many platforms are live? I think at this point, more than 5 platforms are already live. In fact, what I'm showing you here are only I would say these are the sectoral platforms. There are fundamental digital infrastructure platforms that are already live. It's not live. They are so popular that they have actually, if you see the volume. So for instance, we have a payment platform, which is called UPI. The number of transactions in that payment platform is more than 25 billion in a year. It's the highest in the world. The next highest is China, which is coming in at 15 billion. So you can see the difference of how people themselves have accepted digital services, and therefore this is pushing the adoption of the platforms. So once a platform is rolled out, the success and the acceptance of it remains very high. It is just the change process that takes time, because obviously some of these changes are very disruptive. So there is an element of pushback that comes in, which is of course common human behavior, right? So, but otherwise, we have been quite, I would say, given the complexity and the diversity and the digital divide that we face in the country, we have been fabulously successful in rolling out digital services within the country, which is architecture driven. And you can see, right, there is, the other thing we have in India is that we can't have any examples which is specific to India scale, right? I can talk of another country with a 5 million population. Yeah, that's good. I learned from them, but a country with a 5 million population has different problems as a country with 1.4 billion. So the comparison is not there. So what we have to do is we have to learn even as we roll out.
Okay, just I'll answer a question. I'm going to post it as well, that the people have been asking for the slides. They really appreciated that. So what we're saying is we'll be posting the slides. The recordings are available now. The slides will be made available to you through the software, and you'll be notified of that. The software actually works quite well with respect to that. So that concludes the session. Pallab, I'd like to thank you a great deal for taking the time and effort to make the presentation. I know it's dark 30 and where you are at this point in time, and appreciate your taking the time and getting up to give. to enlighten us. The work you've done is really quite stunning, and I'm really honored to be working with you at the on the working groups that you chair in the open group, and also it's co-chaired by the United Nations. And basically enterprise architecture and government. It's more than just architecture. You know, we're dealing with digital transformation. And I think India has been a perfect test case. For those of you who are listening, we've got Denis Suzar coming in from the United Nations. He's in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and he's looking at how e-government progress is measured globally. And I know that you know, Dr. Saha and Denise, and he's very much tied into the United Nations efforts, and I think it's laudable. And we'll also be listening to Yolanda later this morning, Yolanda Martinez, and she's going to be talking about some of these models that Palab highlighted and how it can be shared and help emerging nations just use architecture to save themselves a tremendous amount of time and angst, and to provide them some patterns that they can reuse internally and save themselves years of work and considerable sums of money in basically developing their digital infrastructure in accordance with their needs. Okay, for that. Well, anyways, I don't see any more questions. So again, Palab, thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you, Bob. It was my pleasure.
And I'll just want to say is we're going to have a small break, and then afterwards we're going to have Scott Taylor. He's the Director General Digital Enablement at Shared Services Canada. And then Dr. Yolanda Martinez, and she's going to be talking about the United Nations International Telecommunications Union to give a presentation on the GovStack Shared Services for Emerging Nations. Both of those are great. This afternoon, we have a super lineup of digital transformation in emerging nations, government design and innovation using enterprise architecture, and also leading digital transformation in government, where we'll be having key members of the CIO office and the new Chief Data Officer office giving presentations this afternoon. But anyways, without further ado, thank you very much. Okay, folks, have a good coffee break. Presentations will be posted, and please, presentations will be posted, and please make sure that you know, you log back in and get the other presentations. Are going to be absolutely great, and they all build upon one another. They're grouped so that they are complementary. Okay, thank you very much.